Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of National Defence.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And this is one of those times where, as parliamentarians, we take on one of the greatest debates. Something that only happens under this Conservative government, of course, is that we debate the deployment of our troops and put them in harm's way. This is something that practice that we began with the Afghanistan mission. We did it with Libya, and this is the second time now we're doing it with Operation Impact. And I know that our troops are always prepared to go into harm's way. This is a mission that they volunteer for. This is a life career that they choose, and I know that their training and their skill and their bravery will serve them well as they carry out the mission in Iraq and Syria. With that, I'd like to pay tribute to Sergeant Andrew Doron for his sacrifice for country. He unfortunately was killed in a friendly fire accident that occurred in the Kurdish region, where he was working alongside our Kurdish Peshmerga partners in training them and advising them and assisting them, essentially making sure that they can execute their battle plans and win back territory and liberate villages that have been taken by ISIL. At the same time, we have to remember some of the first casualties that ISIL has been able to inspire, and that includes Corporal Nathan Cirillo, who died at the National War Memorial when the attack on Parliament Hill occurred on October 22nd, days before we ever deployed any Air Force, and also Warrant Officer Patrice Vincent, who was targeted October 20th in St. Jean-sur-Richelieu, of doing, of all things, getting a cup of coffee at Tim Hortons. You know, ISIL is an incredible threat. You know, it's been said that they're using 21st century social media, 20th century weaponry to carry out 13th century barbarism. This threat we have been witnessing on TV as they have promoted their genocide. This jihadist terrorist organization has documented the crucifixion of Christians, of how the death cult trapped so many Yazidis on the mountain. We watched as they sell women and girls into sexual slavery. And we've seen them behead all other ethnic minorities, including Shias and what they call prostrate Sunnis. And they just don't stop with the adults. We've watched them murder children. This ethnic cleansing was horrific and gut-wrenching for anyone that saw it, and of course it was well played in the media. But they didn't just stop there with their ethnic cleansing, with their genocide, with their jihadist, warped ideology and screwed up ideas on religion. They captured aid workers, journalists, sold some off into ransoms, but ultimately beheaded most of them on national television and bragged about it. And then we witnessed the very barbaric and sadistic burning of the Jordanian pilot. So this really did establish what was happening in Iraq and Syria and the threat they represented to the region. But we also saw them inspire Westerners, including Canadians, to sign up and travel to Syria and Iraq and become jihadist warriors. We saw them inspire people around the world, including here in Canada, to become terrorists in our own countries. We saw what happened in Copenhagen, in France, in Australia, and this organization, this jihadist, genocidal death cult called ISIL, the Islamic State, has to be stopped. And it's in Canada's national interest to go to Iraq, as we have been for the last 6 months, and expand this mission to include Syria, to ensure that ISIL doesn't establish their caliphate, headquartered out of the so-called capital of Raqqa. Because if they do that, Mr. Speaker, they will continue to bring their terror to Canada, to our allies, and continue to have their genocide grow in the region. It's never been the Canadian way to sit on the sidelines. It's never been the Canadian way to take a pass when you have these types of brutal regimes gaining ground. And because of our intervention, along with our allies, 25% of the territory in Iraq now has been won back. The aid and assist role that Canada and our coalition partners have played with our Special Operation Forces in training Iraqi and Kurdish militias and security forces has been so far successful. Our airstrikes have supported them and have degraded the capability of ISIL within Iraq. But they are coalescing and consolidating their fighting team in Syria, in eastern Syria. It's a lawless land in the east, and ISIL has control. The terminology and really, when it comes down to it, the reasoning why we need to go to Syria to uproot ISIL and degrade them so they're not a threat to us here in Canada is no different than when the Liberals first deployed the Canadian Armed Forces, without debate in this House of Commons, but deployed them to Afghanistan because of the safe haven that the Taliban was offering to al-Qaeda, for allowing them the ability to go out and attack our allies, which included killing Canadians in the 9/11 attacks in New York and in Washington. And of course, al-Qaeda had been perpetrating these types of attacks around the world against predominantly U.S. Interests and U.S. Facilities, but those targets were ultimately nailed by the terrorist activities. But that principle, that objective, which the Liberal government of 2002 saw as being necessary and committed us to a war that lasted 12 years, was done without any debate, without any transparency. And that national interest is no different today than it was back then. You know, through this whole process, we've been extremely accountable. I know that today I've been hearing the opposition criticize us for not being accountable. We're the first government to bring forward resolutions for full debate and full disclosure on these missions before we deploy or extend. We're the first government that have held ongoing technical briefings with the media and with our parliamentarians on what's happening on an ongoing basis. There's been over 15 technical briefings that have been held in the last 6 months on our activities. Plus, the Ministers of National Defence and Foreign Affairs have been appearing before committees of both Foreign Affairs and National Defence to ensure that parliamentarians were informed. You know, we talk about the Liberals and how they have abandoned their values. And you know, I listened to the Minister of Veterans Affairs very closely, how he clearly documented the Liberals' proud history of ensuring that Canada always does the heavy lifting when needed to be in military interventions, which they have completely abandoned today. The Liberals do not replicate or resemble themselves in any way, shape, or form from a decade ago. The NDP side, I don't understand why they wouldn't want to participate. Social democratic parties in Europe, like the leader of France, are involved in the Operation Impact with our allies. We see the Danes and the Dutch are all involved. And they're prepared to sit back and watch this sacrifice taking place, this genocide taking place. They're prepared to sacrifice more lives, and that isn't acceptable. Mr. Speaker, we are going to go forward into Syria under the UN Charter, Article 51, which clearly states that for self-defense or collective self-defense, we have a right to go into another nation where attacks are being launched. And the government of Iraq has made the request. The United States has already reported into the UN that they are going to participate, as they already have for several months, and we will do the same to ensure that we degrade the capability of ISIL to carry out their terrorist attacks and brutality in the region, and of course, prevent them from being able to do it here in Canada or any other allied nation. And we'll continue with our humanitarian aid, Mr. Speaker, because it is important. Canada has been very generous. The taxpayers of Canada, via the government, have already been charitable and donated over $700 million to help feed 1.7 million refugees in the region. They've helped clothe and shelter 1.25 million people and allow 500,000 kids to get to school, Mr. Speaker. And in closing, I would just say this, that we will continue to do that in the long term, as the Prime Minister has said, to ensure that once we achieve peace and stability in the region, that we'll help rebuild it, as Canada has always done, because we are a generous nation.